Was it in Liverpool?
Yeah, it was a small town just 30 miles or so from Liverpool.
Yes. That
It's called
situation.
Southport.
Southport, yeah. And one of the allegation was the continuous abuse online that happened, and it was happening at a very fast pace. Can you comment on that? Would you think the existence of this particular law, if the law was in existence and is being implemented, would it be able to stop gap the abuse, the fast pace of the information flowing out? So good morning. Thank you again for giving us this opportunity to have a face-to-face indirectly on a platform to discuss in reference to the Online Safety Act. So my first question would be to both of you. Could you please share the gist of the UK Online Safety Act, the whole drafting, the process, and how the Online Safety Act network came to existence?
So I did a research project which suggested that direct content regulation on the internet would be quite difficult to manage. And so the thought was that given that the various services control the online environment, they design it, and that the design choices affect information flows, that maybe it will be a more fruitful way forward to try to regulate the choice architecture of a service as well as its way of operation. So that was a move away from direct content regulation to systems regulation. And this idea was picked up by the UK government in its white paper, the Online Harms White Paper, and then I suppose formed the basis of the approach in what became the Online Safety Act. So what the Online Safety Act does is it imposes on regulated services, and that's basically social media and search. It imposes on those services a series of duties. The first duty is a risk assessment duty, a duty to assess the likely risks of harmful content being on the platform, being prevalent on a platform, and then a duty called the safety duty to take reasonable steps to mitigate those risks. So that's the basis of it, is a risk assessment and a risk mitigation obligation imposed first of all on social media and then on search, drafted slightly differently to take account of the difference in the nature of the services. The government also decided to distinguish between two main types of content. The first type of content is illegal content. So that is content related to criminal offences. And those duties apply to all regulated services. There are general obligations to mitigate, an obligation to run a moderation and takedown process, but also some more specific duties in relation to particular criminal offences that were identified in the Act. That is a duty to try and restrict the prevalence and the length of time that sort of content's available. The second type of content is content harmful to children. And that applies only to services where children are likely to access them. So not to services which perhaps age gate the service. Again, there's a general duty to mitigate risks, and again, some specific duties in relation to identified types of content. So this would be things like pornography or self-harm content, and that is to be restricted so children can't access it. On a limited number of services, there are some additional duties around user empowerment and protecting journalistic content and content of democratic importance, as well as rules relating to enforcement of terms of service. Final element is, of course, the regulator. We have an independent communications regulator in the UK, Ofcom. It already regulated broadcasting and telecommunications, and it had online safety added to its remit. And it has enforcement powers, large fines, and in extreme cases, the possibility to apply for business disruption measures. And that would be, as a final case, blocking the service. So that's an overview of the regulatory regime. Maybe I'll hand to Maeve about how it happened.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
and
thank you.
yes, Professor Woods has set out there where the idea that kind of underpins the Online Safety Act originated. And I guess it's important just to bear in mind that while the Act took a long time to pass in the UK. It's 6 or 7 years really from the initial policy development to it receiving royal assent last year. At the time that these discussions started, there was very much a sense that it was too difficult really to regulate social media services and to impose a form of regulation on internet companies. And the idea that Professor Woods had really broke through that debate and removed the sense that tech platforms were in some ways kind of exceptional and couldn't be subject to regulation in the way that other sectors were too. So the importance of that proposal was very much identified and supported by Carnegie UK, which is a not-for-profit organisation here in the UK, who provided us with a home really to keep developing the idea. And we did that through lots of blogs, through papers, through a huge amount of analysis, lots of it led by Professor Woods. We did an awful lot in terms of influencing select committees, put huge numbers of submissions, thousands of words into parliamentary select committees looking at this particular issue. And gradually the idea of a statutory duty of care, of this approach, this risk-based approach, really began to take hold. And it was around that time then, sort of 2018, 2019, when lots of the children's charities in particular, who could see some of the most egregious harms occurring and the difficulties of victims as a result of harms occurring on social media. The children's charities in the first instance picked this up as an idea that they could very much get behind. So one of the important bits of the Carnegie UK role really was building quite a loose but very broad coalition of civil society organisations. So it started with the children's charities, and we ended up then with a huge range of interest groups spanning online hate, online abuse, misinformation and disinformation, extremism and so forth. We had a number of specific spin-off coalitions, if you like, who are campaigning for very specific additional elements to be added to the legislation. So, for instance, we had a group working on online fraud and online scams, which we collaborated with, and that included financial sector organisations. It included the City of London Police. It included consumer groups and mental health charities, all coming together to ask for amendments to be added to the developing legislation to address those issues. Similarly, on violence against women and girls, we're still working with the same coalition there of victims groups, people who look at domestic abuse and stalking and so forth. And the campaign there was successful in ensuring that the Act provided for guidance to be produced for protecting women and girls. Prior to that, there was no mention at all of women in the Act, but the campaign and that coalition proved to be very successful in ensuring that that aspect was covered. So to get to where we are now, the Online Safety Act Network very much continues that work. It was very much appreciated at the point of royal assent that this civil society interest and certainly the number of campaign groups who had a key part in ensuring that the legislation was passed, their interest in this wasn't going to end with the law being passed. And in fact, the involvement in the detail of implementation and in the work that Ofcom needs to do over the coming years was as important as getting the Act passed in the first instance. So at the network, we still provide a home for those organisations to come together, to share information, to collaborate on particular issues where we feel that there may be more that needs to be done, and increasingly looking ahead, looking at what new legislation, new amendments, new approaches might be needed to address the harms that continue to arise. So we're still very busy, and we're still very much involved in this, and it's nice to be able to see this through from beginning to wherever the end may be.
Yeah, thank you so much for the whole process of the experience. The second question that I've been barged with a lot of the MPs who definitely from Malaysia, they're going to raise this issue on the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. We know very well there's going to be a big, huge debate point that will be raised. From your perspective, how did the government or the executive handled this during the debate in reference to the balancing of the freedom of expression?
Well, obviously, in the UK, the question of freedom of expression was a significant issue as well. It is an important right. What happened in the UK was that there are specific obligations on service providers when they are carrying out their duties to have regard to the importance of freedom of expression, but also privacy. So privacy is another right that is flagged by the Act. And I mentioned in my overview that there were specific duties in relation to certain sorts of content, the journalistic content, and also content of democratic importance. And those obligations to have regard to the importance of those types of content in a democratic society were also driven by this concern to ensure that we didn't inadvertently, I guess, chill democratic debate. The other point to note is that the regulator is independent, but it is also subject to general duties under a piece of legislation in the UK called the Human Rights Act. And that obliges public bodies to exercise their powers within the framework of the convention rights. That's the European Convention on Human Rights. So you have that general obligation, which affects how Ofcom carries out its duties. And you can see Ofcom has responsibility for bringing in further guidance and codes of practice as to how companies might carry out their duties. And in those codes, you can see the regulator reflecting on the importance of freedom of expression in particular.
I see. So that is why the regulator must be independent, taking that into account.
Yes, historically, the regulators, since the sort of privatization of utilities, have tended to be at arm's length from the government departments, and in particular, Ofcom was set up to be independent. And part of the concern there is a concern around public speech and ensuring that it reflects a diversity of views.
So there's no possibility of abuse in that process, I suppose.
Well, we would hope not. I mean, the concern to maintain the independence of the regulator was one of the important issues that was debated as the bill went through, to ensure that it could not be a vehicle for, I suppose, specific instructions from the government of the day. The government can set general policy level objectives, obviously, and the regulator needs to be transparent and accountable about what it's doing. But the day-to-day implementation should be a decision for the regulator based on the best evidence we have about these issues as we go forward.
Okay. Would you like to add anything, Ms. Walsh, in reference to the independence?
No, I think Professor Woods has explained it very well there, and I think as Ofcom is getting into the process now of preparing to implement the Act, that independence is very important. It doesn't stop the political debates and the policy debates going on about the way in which Ofcom should be approaching this or should be enforcing it, but that independence and the separation from direct sort of political control and political influence is going to be really important, I think, in managing particularly the relationships with companies in the months and the years ahead.
Can I, Prof, just go back to what happened to which part was it a few months ago? The riot in the UK riot, remember, because of the misinformation on the three children who were being stabbed. Which part of England was that? Was it in Liverpool? Yeah. Was it in Liverpool?
Yeah, it was a small town just 30 miles or so from Liverpool.
Yes. That situation. Southport, yeah. And one of the allegation was the continuous abuse online that happened, and it was happening at a very fast pace, that were pulling a lot of racist and very angry certain personalities based on a creation of a misinformation on the perpetrator. Can you comment on that? Would you think the existence of this particular law, if the law was in existence and is being implemented, would it be able to stop gap the abuse, the fast pace of the information flowing out within that short period of time? Any observation on that?
Well, the first point to note is obviously the Online Safety Act wasn't applicable at the time. It will only be coming into full force next year. So it's a bit hard to tell how it would actually operate. Certainly, some of the content, the abusive content, was serious enough to trigger the criminal law in the UK, and therefore it is the sort of material that would fall within the illegal content duties. So we might say that companies should have better processes in place for identifying that sort of content, for dealing with complaints swiftly. One of the advantages of looking at a systems-based approach is that we might say that a company could look to see the features of its service that contributes to the virality of that sort of material, and maybe put some points of friction in the process to maybe slow things down. I've always argued, though I don't know whether this will be adopted across the board, but I think companies should have a sort of a triage system in place, so that when events like the Southport riots start, that they're in a position to, if you like, direct extra resources to them so that they can tackle a problem swiftly. The one thing that perhaps the Southport riots did draw attention to is that the Online Safety Act does not really give Ofcom any emergency powers. So it could require the platforms, this is assuming that the rules were in place, it could require the platforms to explain what they're doing in situations of this type, but it has no directive powers. And we can perhaps contrast that with the EU's Digital Services Act, which does allow for an emergency process to take place. Again, that isn't based on the regulator directing services to take content down or do anything in particular, but it does require services themselves to take action according to what they understand best practice to be. So that is maybe something that is maybe a little bit of a gap in the Online Safety Act.
Yeah, but okay, so the next question would be to Ms. Walsh, with what happened in reference to what Prof has just explained. Would it then be better if the regulators had such powers as compared to be totally independent from the executive, to be able to participate, to immediately have such emergency powers? Would it be much better, like a hybrid model in reference to the ability of the regulators?
I think within the British sort of framework that we've got, that kind of model would possibly be a little bit problematic in that kind of very sort of direct intervention way. I think there are aspects where the sort of the flexibility and the speed with which decisions can be made when there is evidence that there is a particular kind of problem online that is having that direct real world impact does need to be kind of looked at. And I think certainly one of the things that was kind of exposed during the summer, I guess, is the fact that that sort of speed of reaction possibly isn't there for times when actually there is more of a direct impact. I think there are issues certainly too around the means by which the prevalence and the kind of the spread of problematic content on smaller platforms is addressed too. Certainly the focus of the regulator in terms of these kinds of threats and risks is very much on those kind of bigger platforms, the very obvious kind of social media platforms. But certainly the Southport example and the things we saw there was the use very much of kind of smaller platforms that would be slightly under the radar in terms of that more direct impact. And certainly, as Professor Woods talks about the kind of the illegal content duties, those platforms would be required to comply with those illegal content duties. But there was a lot of other stuff going on there that was much more directly to do with kind of instigating and provoking kind of a particular reaction, which maybe isn't covered. So I think there's more an issue about how reactive and responsive the sort of the legislative the amendments to the legislative framework can be, if you see what I mean, rather than necessarily changing very specifically the kind of the roles or the interventions of each party.
Okay, Diego, any questions?
Thank you, Minister. I think the conversation went very well. Just very quickly, Professor Lorna, of course, Malaysia can come up very quickly this law, but of course, we have taken so many months, the works that we have taken before this also included. Thank God we have some models to follow. Luckily, we have UK, Australian models, and of course Canadian models that was very much helpful for us to formulate our policy here. But just wondering, Professor, how wide the illegal content provision under the UK Online Safety Act, and how transparent the system in managing the complaint that comes from the users?
Thank you. The illegal content duties are based on a definition of illegal content, and that is a criminal offence under UK law that is aimed at protecting people. So I suppose offences against property would not be within the Act, but in principle, any UK offence that is aimed at protecting people triggers these obligations. So on one sense, it's quite broad. The government did identify particular types of criminal offence as what's called priority content, and these are the sorts of content where there's more intensive obligations on the companies to try and reduce the amount of that sort of content in the first place, rather than just taking it down after the event. And there's 3 schedules to the Act listing the priority content. The first schedule deals with all the child sexual abuse and exploitation offences. The next schedule deals with relevant terrorism offences. And then the third of the schedules, which is actually Schedule 7, has a list of other offences. And this ranges from the hate speech rules, harassment and stalking offences, things like the illegal sale of weapons. So there's quite a range of other offences covered. So that was listed, I think, partly to ensure that the companies knew those offences were there and that they are important issues to be dealt with. It is also, I think, a way of ensuring a certain amount of transparency as to what the key focus of the Act is. Ofcom was mandated with the responsibility to give guidance to the companies on what these offences might look like, how they might identify them in practice. So Ofcom has come up with something called the Illegal Content Judgment Guidance, and it consulted on that earlier in the year. At the same time, it did its other consultations. So we're waiting for that statement to come out. So that is another way of adding certainty into, or as far as you can get certainty in this space, so adding that clarity into the regime as to what's seen as important. I don't know if that answers the question.
That excellently answered. And in fact, Malaysia also looking into the possibilities of several types of contents. In fact, that is very much similar with the UK's priority contents, and also the normal illegal contents that have classified under the particular schedule under the UK Online Safety Act. With that regard, Professor and also Walsh, my another question, that we noted that the importance of the system-based approach of managing the content and also content moderation. But we would think that hybrid model would be ideal for any country, because we cannot discount the fact that the regulator need some circumstances where the content moderation is needed as well. Could you please add on that, Professor and also Walsh?
I'll go first, perhaps, seeing as my mic's on. I think the value of a systems approach is that maybe it reduces the intensity of the problem, and it maybe makes the services less open to abuse, in particular by bad actors. But I don't think a systems approach is ever going to deal entirely with all items of problematic content. The UK's approach was not to require a specific notice and action regime, but rather to say that the companies had to have systems in place capable of dealing with complaints. So the UK system doesn't really provide for a take this individual item of content down. Insofar as that is available, it is through other provisions in UK law generally. For example, I think in the Defamation Act, if someone wins a defamation claim, then they can ask for an order from the court requiring the defamatory content to be taken down. So insofar as there are distinct takedown provisions, they're elsewhere. I think once you move into a space where you are expecting companies to act on particular items of content, then you need to look at the safeguards that are in place, because I think the potential intrusion into people's free speech and possibly privacy rights become more intense in that context than they do when we are talking about more, I suppose, content neutral interventions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also, I suppose, just thinking more broadly about what a sort of, systems-based approach means, it also looks then at the way in which, content is created and shared and spread, and the impact of the virality potentially of individual pieces of content that then become problematic because of that scale. So the systems-based approach picks up some of those aspects that are beyond the actual moderation of the content, but looking at that, as I say, the way in which the platform or the service creates conditions in which that content can have outsized impact or outsized influence. I suppose there's one other aspect to talk about in relation to content moderation that I suppose is about systems too, is one of the considerations for platforms in terms of doing their content moderation is whether they've resourced it properly, and whether the people who, or the systems, or the automated systems, if they are automated, are set up in a way to ensure that they are picking the kind of and spotting the right types of content, and that they are able, again, to deal. We talked earlier about the impact of the activity on social media that led to the riots in the summer, that those content moderation systems can be scaled up at times of crisis, and can actually kind of ensure that there is a safety valve, if you like, when needed at times of particular pressure. So I think there's content moderation in the sense of individual decisions, if you like, and then there are all the systems that are set up to take those decisions with all the safeguards that Professor Woods talked about. But then there is the broader sense of the system in which those content moderation processes kind of work too, which is just as important, I think.
Lastly, Professor, from my end, the UK Online Safety Act did render some assistance to bring down the issue of UK riots matter. So how do you see that scenario?
Well, over the summer, the Act wasn't in force. So I think the regulator, Ofcom, was in a little bit of a difficult position. It did write the companies to outline steps they could take and what they could do in future cases. But it's a little difficult to see the Online Safety Act as allowing Ofcom to make direct interventions on sort of on the ground in response to a crisis. I think the aim of the Act is to try and make the systems themselves, the systems operated by the companies, better able to do that sort of response as part of the way the company runs its business. So it's trying to, in a way, make these companies better citizens and have better systems in place around, I suppose, the day-to-day running, normal running of such a service, as well as more emergency circumstances.
I think it's basically our version will be a hybrid version because the regulator is government regulators, and because of the licensing, we're registering on the licensing, so we may able to surpass that. I think that's it. Anything else?
Yeah, all good.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor and Ms. Walsh, and with your experience and the processes that you went through, I hope I can succeed in bringing the second reading to the bill next week, which would be Tuesday and Wednesday. So we'll tell you the good news or the bad news, whether they have not vote yes, yay on my bill, or they've requested to be sent to the select committee. I hope they don't. So thank you so much. And if we don't meet again, I would like to wish both of you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Well, good luck with the bill, and all the best for Christmas and the New Year as well. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Good to speak to you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye
Bye.
now.
Bye.